Welcome to the first set of panels for the third annual Theories in Action Conference. I hope all of you got to hear Amy Rebensteiner give that absolutely fabulous talk a little while ago, because she set exactly the right tone, I think, for this conference. I'm Gail Cohee. I direct the Sarah Doyle Women's Center, and I'm faculty in Gender and Sexuality Studies, and it's really nice to see all of you here. The panel is Channels of Choice. Do we have a say in representation? And we have four fabulous panelists here. Reuben and Henriques, whose presentation is The Jury Box and the Ballot Box, Mandatory Participation, Democracy, and the Liberal Citizen. Leor Shtull-Leber, From Scholarship to Sales, Sounds, Meaning, and Memory in Branding Linguistics. Tyler Rogers, it's not in the right order, Sam Karshenboym.
We switched up the order.
You switched up. Does television change attitudes? A Breaking Bad and Weeds study. And then Tyler J. Rogers, Gender, Race, and Reality Television, Discourses of Sisterhood on Braxton Family Values. Each of them will give more of an introduction to themselves and talk a little bit more about their papers and how they arrived at this particular panel and how they've made some connections here. Each will speak for a few minutes, and then at the end we'll have time for questions. So,
just any introductions. So my name is Reuben. I'm a political science major. My thesis basically looked at mandatory voting laws, so laws that require people to vote, and compare them to jury duty laws to see sort of what similarities there might be in the arguments in favor of both of them.
Hi, I'm Leor Shtull-Leber. I'm a senior concentrating in cognitive science, and I've done a focus on applied cognitive science. And last semester, in conjunction with an internship at Hasbro, where I was helping name toys, and I was brought in to bring some science to the naming process. I did an independent study trying to find out what the science of the naming process was so I could bring it to them. With Professor Kertz, who's here.
Hi everyone, my name is Sam Karshenboym. I'm from New Jersey. I'm concentrating in sociology and French, and this year I did a sociology thesis that examined whether television changes attitudes. And I had a study with Brown University students watching either the show Breaking Bad or Weeds, and through a series of surveys and discussions, I answered the question whether television changes attitudes. Stay tuned. Get it? Get it?
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Tyler Rogers, and I'm a senior from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, concentrating in ethnic studies and gender and sexuality studies. And tonight I'm going to be presenting a version of my Gender and Sexuality Studies capstone project, in which I perform a close reading of Discourses of Sisterhood amongst a group of black women on WeTV's celebrity reality show Braxton Family Values, and also look in turn at how ideas of sisterhood are negotiated and understood by black female viewers. So just to give a brief outline of how the next hour and 15 minutes is going to work, I'm going to start off by just giving a brief introduction of the panel theme and how we came to that idea and how we came to this great title. That actually it was Leor's idea because she has all this experience in branding. And then we're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes each going over our individual presentations, explaining our research project, and also spending a few minutes at the end of each presentation engaging with this question, do we have a say in representation, offering our own ideas about that based on our projects. And then we hope to spend the last 15 to 20 minutes as kind of an open discussion facilitated by Professor Cohee, and place our projects further in dialogue with each other, and also answer any questions or respond to comments that any of you all might have. So to start off with, really this is the key question. What do our projects have in common? We have a project about political participation. We have a project about product branding. We have two projects about TV, albeit from different methodological perspectives. So although we really don't have a definitive answer to this question still, the theme that really unites our project is this issue of representation. We realize that that's kind of something that ties our projects together, specifically in terms of how agency is functioning within how representation is operating in these different particular milieus. So that's how we came up with this title, Channels of Choice, Do We Have a Say in Representation? And so we hope to really, if not answer this question, at least provide some different ideas in how we might think about this particular question.
All right. So I want to start off by sort of talking about this idea of liberal democracy. And we say we live in a liberal democracy, and there's kind of two central concepts there that are a little bit in tension. On the one hand, we have the liberty to do whatever we want, right? We should be free within reason to sort of act as we will. On the other hand, we live in a democracy, and a democracy requires people to do certain things because we have to actually govern ourselves. We have to do certain actions of government. And so my question was really what happens when these two different concepts come into conflict with one another, when we want to be free not to participate. What sorts of actions might democracy require of its citizens, and how do we balance rights and responsibilities within a liberal democracy? So my thesis aims to answer these sort of big questions about democracy by looking more narrowly at an examination of two different kinds of laws that require political participation. Jury duty laws, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with, and mandatory voting laws, which we don't have in America, but about 30 countries do have, and they sort of require you to actually, to vote in an election, you have to pay a fine, or there's sort of other penalties that vary across countries. And I'm going to situate them within broader ideas in sort of democratic theory and political philosophy. Is this? Oh, yes. Yes, these are the questions. Is there like a clicking thing we should do?
Yeah, is it not clicking more?
It's not working. No.
Okay.
Let's just see if I can bring it.
Okay. Yeah. Can you just show the whole thing? So yeah. So I'm going to start off by introducing sort of these two kinds of laws and the justification for them, and sort of there's two, I think, major justifications in the literature and in both scholarship and in the popular culture for mandatory political participation. And some people say that making people participate forms better citizens. It gets you thinking about the common good. It starts you participating in other ways in your community, sort of gets you outside of yourself. And sort of historically, this is a really big argument. People like John Stuart Mill, Alexis de Tocqueville talk about it, as well as sort of more contemporary scholars. This is really interesting. I wrote a bunch about it in my thesis, but I'm going to sort of set it aside because it doesn't quite relate to this idea of representation. So if people want to talk about it in the question and answer, I'd be happy to. What I am going to talk about is this idea of democratic legitimacy. And people who say that jury trials or elections where everyone turns out to vote are more democratic or more legitimate. And sort of say that it makes the outcomes better. And that makes us sort of ask, what does it mean if something is more democratic than another? So second, I'm going to go through and discuss two sort of fundamental conceptions of democratic legitimacy. There's a number of ways you can understand what democracy is. I'm going to talk about sort of these two sort of major ones that really focus on representation. And as we'll see, different conceptions of democratic legitimacy affect the way that we situate participation within democracy. And so then I'm going to go on and apply these different conceptions of democratic legitimacy to both jury duty and mandatory voting. And ultimately, I argue that because people on a jury are by nature sort of 12 people who have to represent the rest of society and sort of do justice in everyone's name, and also represent the interests of the people on a case who aren't in the jury room. So they're sort of speaking for many other people, and they have this obligation and sort of a responsibility to participate, and we can then mandate jury duty on that regards. Whereas voting is a universal right. In every election, everyone can turn out to vote, and as long as everyone is free to vote to represent themselves, it's much harder to sort of set up voting as a duty that people might have that we want to enforce by law. Now it is working. Can you
maybe put on this, maybe this closer.
Oh, yeah, there you go. All right. So there's sort of all kinds of different mandatory political participation, and people talk about sort of different ones and different coordination. So taxation is one, right? That's for forced to participate in that sense. National military service, like the draft. A lot of countries you have to serve your couple of years in the military. Jury duty, as I said, and mandatory voting. Obviously, this last one's the most controversial. Australia is sort of one of the oldest cases, and it's a really good example. You're required to vote in every election. If you don't, you get a little letter, and they ask you to pay a $20 fine. So it's a pretty small penalty, but almost everyone votes. It's about 90 to 95% turnout in every election, which is pretty good. And so I'm going to focus on kind of the latter two, jury duty and mandatory voting, because I think that they're fundamentally democratic in a way that taxes and military service aren't. And what I mean by this is that we justify jury duty and mandatory voting with reference to democratic values. We might ask, why not have a judge make decisions, or why not have a really smart king make the decisions? And the answer to that question is really a fundamentally democratic answer, because there's something valuable about bringing the people into the decision-making process, right? And so either we might say that when we bring people in, we get better outcomes, we get more just outcomes, we get more legitimate outcomes, we get more correct outcomes, or we might just say that there's an independent good to bringing people into the process to make it sort of fairer and sort of representing these important democratic values in the process itself. And so in order to understand what kind of a good jury duty or mandatory voting might provide, we have to really understand why juries or elections are good in the first place. In order to do that, we have to understand really this huge question, which is why democracy? And what's the good of democracy? Why not have decisions made by the best and the brightest? And so there's sort of two sort of dichotomous arguments about why democracy is good. And some are outcome-based or substantive, and they say that democracy produces better outcomes. The decisions that it makes are better. And then the sort of contrast with that is what we might call a fair proceduralist conception. And so a fair proceduralist conception of democracy says that the process of decision-making has to sort of treat everyone as free and equal citizens and treat everyone fairly, to respect their moral equality. And so under the purest sort of fair proceduralist argument, what we say is that anything that comes out of a fair procedure is legitimate. It doesn't matter what the decision is, as long as it was voted on under fair processes, that's what we should do. And it can be, people can try to bring in sort of bills of rights or something, but generally it's really all about the procedure. And another view looks at outcomes. And the one that I'm going to sort of focus on is what I call the aggregative conception of democracy. And it says that the best outcome is the one that's preferred by a plurality or a majority, ideally, of people. So whether that's what most people think is in their self-interest, we want to sort of maximize preference satisfaction, or it's what most people think is in the public interest. And there's sort of a lot of different sub-arguments in here that I'm not going to go into. But either way, we're talking not about processes, but about an outcome, right? So we're saying that we have this ideal outcome. We want to find the decision that satisfies the most people, that most people think is right. And voting, or juries, is the best way of getting at that. And so the processes of democracy sort of serve this function. And to sort of illustrate this, we can imagine that if everyone went out and voted randomly, didn't think about what they were doing, and we saw sort of, we voted Mitt Romney into office, let's say. Under a fair proceduralist conception of democracy, we would say that was fine, that was democratically legitimate. And an aggregative conception would be a little bit more skeptical, because those votes didn't reflect anything real about people's preferences. And so why does this matter, right? This is like a sort of abstract questions about democracy. But it's really important because a lot of people say things like juries make verdicts more legitimate, or mandatory voting would make the outcome of an election more democratic. And we have to ask what these things mean, right? Legitimacy or democracy. And now sort of having this aggregation and fair proceduralist conception, we've got two answers, two different conceptions of legitimacy. And as we're going to see, that those are going to lead to very different evaluations of sort of the role of mandatory participation and the effect of mandating participation on democratic legitimacy. So let's sort of start out by applying it to jury participation. Actually, I'm going to skip this slide. So does jury duty actually make verdicts more legitimate? So how might we justify juries under a fair proceduralist argument? Well, we could say that we need to recognize all citizens as people who are morally entitled to participate in the processes of doing justice. And everyone, a judge is no better than me or you in doing this. We're all democratic citizens. And there's been a huge amount of battle sort of fought and won over this. In order to get, for example, African Americans the right to serve on a jury was a huge sort of legal battle for much of the past century. But the problem is that this doesn't actually give right to an argument for making people be on juries. It says that we need jury trials, and they need to be open to everyone. But if they were voluntary jury trials, they would still be fair. As long as everyone was free to choose whether or not to actually serve on a jury, the process would treat jurors fairly. But we might respond that juries aren't really about the jurors. They're about the people on trial. And we don't really care about we do care about people who are on a jury, but really we want to focus on the way that juries sort of provide a certain judgment for the people whose case is at issue. And that leads us to focus a little bit more on outcomes. And so the aggregation of judgments, I think, is a stronger argument in this case. And it's a little bit weird of an argument, but I think if you think about the Supreme Court, right, there's a lot of different ways we can apply the law to a set of facts. So you can look at the text of the law, you can look at sort of the spirit of the framers of the law, you can look at sort of democratic values. And we might say that those are all equally legitimate in society. And the only way to choose among them is to see which one is preferred by the most people, which of those many ways of sort of judging a case is preferred by the most people in society. And this is sort of aggregative, right? We want to take the one that the majority likes. And so one way we could sort of get at this outcome is we could show every single person in America every single trial and have them all vote on the verdict. And that would get the aggregative standard, but it would be completely implausible, right? So jury duty can sort of stand in as a little mini opinion poll. And if a jury is representative of the society at large, we might say that, well, the outcome that the jury reaches sort of reflects this aggregation standard, right? So if a jury is sort of represents society, you can assume that their deliberations mirror what would happen if we had everyone in society deliberate. And in order for this argument to work, juries need to be representative. And in order for juries to be representative, they have to come from all of society. If we only had white men on a jury, or if we only had black women on a jury, they would not really be serving their purpose. And so we need to be able to sort of draft everyone into jury duty. And that, I think, is a really strong argument for making it mandatory. And there's many others, but sort of in terms of representation, I think that's a really strong one. So what happens? There's a couple more minutes. Yeah, okay. So mandatory voting, how could we sort of apply these same arguments to that? So fair proceduralism, again, might argue for voting but not for mandatory voting, I think. It's fair to let everyone choose to vote or not to vote. And there's still a lot of battles to be done in order to make sure that everyone can sort of access the polls. Making sure that election day isn't falling on a weekday, that you don't have sort of unrealistic photo ID requirements to vote. But as long as we can sort of overcome those obstacles, which would be a prerequisite for mandatory voting in the first place, we don't need to actually require that everyone goes and votes. So what if we said instead that voting wasn't all about you? Like jury duty, you owe it to other people to ensure that justice is done and the right decisions are made. And we need to find whatever decision in an election is preferred by the majority of people. And so this is a really good critique of the way that voting works right now, actually, because right now there's huge disparities and inequalities in terms of who shows up to vote. Rich people, white people, educated people show up much more than sort of more disadvantaged groups. But the problem is that if our arguments about representation, this doesn't give us any argument in favor of universal mandatory voting. We could just as easily govern by an opinion poll, right? Because this is the argument of a jury. As long as we scientifically sample a representative subset of society, we can sort of assume that they're going to produce the same outcome. And that's really weird. And it sort of casts doubt in this application of the aggregation to voting. And so I think that ultimately there's a much weaker argument for mandatory voting than there is for jury duty. And the idea of representation explains why. Because you can either represent yourself or you can represent other people. And fair proceduralism says that what's important is that you can represent yourself. You focus on how the process treats you as a decision maker. And you can't really be made to represent yourself. There's no argument really that would say you should be forced to go out and represent yourself for your own good. Aggregation, in contrast, says you need to represent everyone else in society. You are speaking not just for yourself, but because you're doing something on behalf of other people and in their interests. And you might have a duty to contribute to finding that right outcome over all of society. The problem is that, as we saw, this sort of leads to a representation argument, a sampling argument that works much better for juries than for mandatory voting. Because when we're on a jury, we're tasked with the responsibility of making decisions for people who are not part of that process. As I said at the beginning, people on a jury have to decide for parties in a case who aren't in the jury room, or for people in society who have interests in the way that a case is done, but aren't on that particular jury. We have to speak for them all when you're a juror. But when you're a vote, no one is really shut out. And if we can sort of break down the structural barriers to voting, and that's a huge task, but if we break those down, no one is shut out. Everyone can go vote if they want, and they can also go and lobby their senators. They can go and do any other form of political action that it might be equally or even more effective at getting the outcome that they want. And voting is much more about individual autonomy and speaking for yourself. And so ultimately, I think what we need to do is make sure that we work to be in a society where everyone is a part of the political community and can represent themselves however they want. But it's only when you start to represent other people and have these duties to others to speak on their behalf that we can really mandate participation. Yeah, sorry, I sort of gave me the fun point.
Recap, so you remember. Cool. So branding linguistics is not democratic, and it's actually this sort of hot new field that a lot of consumer packaged good companies are bringing in linguists to help them name their products and to bring in some real validity to the process. So instead of, you actually do have the best and brightest, apparently, on one hand, making the decisions. And there's a company called Lexicon Branding, which is doing a lot of this. And this is sort of they have this on their website. So talking about the names, they help name the words, the brand Swiffer. And they say Swiffer. The S and W represent the brushing and rushing sound against the floor. The I, the lightest vowel, also represents that it's quick. And the compares it to other cleaning products. So scrubbers and cleaners and dusters. Whereas Ready Mop, what mop isn't ready? That's from their website. So the question is this, for lack of a better word, is this BS, or is this a real thing? That these sounds convey something about the words and the products and the brands. So, that's not right. Can you go back one? That's weird. Okay, that's like the last slide.
Wait.
I think they're backwards. We can go do the whole thing backwards. Anyway, okay.
Do you want me to do this?
Find the one that says, how do sounds represent?
I'm not finding it.
Swiffer's a fun
Anyway,
word.
this is going to be more interesting without the slides because we have interactive parts. So the question is, do sounds actually represent meaning? Is there one that says... anyway,
No.
I can keep going. Do sounds actually represent meaning? And there's this idea called sound symbolism, which says exactly that sounds represent meaning. So this actually goes back to Plato, who has a line in one of his plays that says there's such thing as a good word or a bad word. But the first empirical work was done in 1929 by a guy named Sapir. And if anyone's heard of the Sapir-Whorfian hypothesis that language shapes thought, it's the same guy. And what he did is he took the words mill and mall, and then told people you have a big table and a small table. Which word goes with which? So let's do it. The word mill. Raise your hand if you would put that with the small table. Raise your hand if you put mill with the big table. So you guys are, yeah, okay. Well, the majority of you are like Sapir's participants. 80% of them, both English speakers, Chinese speakers, and across various ages, associated mill with a small table and mall with the big table. So is there something there? Is there something actually in the words that represents magnitude and size? This idea that sound represents meaning is not something that is totally foreign to us. We have in our language sounds that represent emotional states. Arg represents frustration. We have sounds that represent environmental things, animal noises, grr, and onomatopoeia. Like,
I think we got it back.
Oh,
sorry.
fun.
I don't know. I think it might have like erased it. I don't know.
Anyway, okay, but we can go.
But
Oh,
now
I
we're
have
good.
the power now.
Yes.
And onomatopoeia, like bing. And then also there's some more interesting ones and maybe more controversial ones that maybe there are consonant clusters that actually have meaning. So in English, you see the GL consonant cluster in a lot of words associated with vision. And you have this oral sound at the end of a lot of round things. And linguists are probably more likely to think that onomatopoeia is a real thing as opposed to these because though you also have words like puny and petite, what do you do about the word pound cake? So there's debate over how realistic this is because it's easy to find patterns, but there's always going to be exceptions. But the question is more, if we're actually looking at individual sounds, which are phonemes, is there in individual sounds, is there actually meaning? And a lot of the work has been done in vowel sounds. All right, so we're going to do this together. We're going to go through the list and read the words out loud. I'm sorry that it's hard for you guys to see it. So let's try it. Be, bin, bay, bet, ban, cot, home, put, boot. Sorry. So I don't know if you noticed, but as you were saying these words, your tongue was moving from the front of your mouth towards the back of your mouth. There's a distinction between what we call front vowels and back vowels, be as opposed to boot. And there's an idea that maybe these distinction between front vowels and back vowels have some meaning to them, that maybe we actually associate these sounds with certain meanings. So a guy named Klink did a lot of research on this in particular. Okay, and he asked people questions like this. So we're creating a ketchup. Which ketchup name seems thicker? Raise your hand if you think it's Needax. Raise your hand if you think it's Nodax. How about? Will you just go to the next one for me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, how about if you have a laptop, which one seems smaller? Detol? Dutol. And how an airline service, which one is friendlier? Ecker? Uker. So you guys are very befitting to his participants also. And what he found was that
Try clicking the other one. There you go.
That with more front vowel sounds, so the Needax was the E was more front, the Detol was more front, the Ecker was more front than the other ones. Oh no, the Nodax was thicker, was a back vowel. Sorry, but he found that with front vowels, so more E sounding, they seemed lighter and more pretty and more feminine and all those things and friendlier. So then the question is it really about the sound and the meaning, or is there something else going on? Because the idea in language is that it's the relationships between sounds that actually make meaning. Or else how could we have an infinite number of words from a finite number of sounds? So there's a lot of people who say this is cool, but it isn't actually about the meaning of the sounds, it's about acoustics and frequencies. When your tongue is near the front of your mouth, it's actually creating a smaller resonance chamber and for the sounds to vibrate as opposed to in the back of the mouth. And so they did similar studies, but without actually having words, even though those aren't real words, just playing sounds. And people also were more likely to say that lower frequency sounds were more dominant and aggressive and bigger and darker than higher frequency sounds. And that's something that we see in our world too. Children have higher pitched voices than adults. Smaller animals like squirrels are going to be squeakier than elephants. So whether it actually has to do with the meaning or whether it's just about frequency is a good question, but the truth is, regardless of what the explanation is, it actually has an impact on the brands that we see in our lives. So Lowry and Shrum did a study where, so before the study with the NEDAX and NODAX, that was all about preference, perceptions of sounds. And this study is actually about preferences. So do those, these words are very similar, do those perceptions actually turn into preferences when people are looking at brands? So they gave people words for cars and fake words like Gimmel and Gommel. And people were more likely to like a brand name with a front vowel for an SUV for a convertible, which is light and quick and fast, than an SUV, which is big and clunky. And similarly, people were more likely to like a brand name if it had a front vowel for a knife, which is sharp, than a hammer, which is dull. So if there was consistency between sort of the attribute of the product and the sound that was part of it, people were more likely to prefer that name. And similarly, even within the same product, but that if different attributes are advertised about it, sorry if it's hard to see. So if you have beer, and the beer is advertised as crisp, cool, and clean, people are more likely to like a brand name for that beer if it had a front vowel, like Brimley as opposed to Bromley, which would be liked more for a smooth, rich, and creamy beer. So that's all about sound, but there's a whole other element of what about just meaning. And a big question for brand names is what's better, a real word or a made-up word, which has some of this sound symbolism in it. And there's arguments for both of them. So in a real word, you get all those associations like smooth and rich and creamy if you just call it, I don't know, creamy beer. That sounds weird, but as opposed to like trying to hint at those meanings with sounds. On the other hand, just a logistical thing is that distinctive words are easier to trademark. If you make up a word, it's much easier to trademark. And there's other issues such as Old Spice. What if they want to target towards young people and they're stuck with this word old in there? And chapstick, what does that mean to German speakers? And then you also have the issue of, they call it genericide, when a word becomes used for everything. So butterscotch, zipper, and escalator were once all trademarked words, and they've become the normal word in our language for those items. And that's more likely to happen if you have a descriptive name, but that's actually arguable because we also have Kleenex and Xerox, which we use, and those aren't real words. So whether this question of real words or made-up words, maybe it actually translates into memory and how we're actually engaging with these products in our lives. So you've seen this one before. So maybe it actually has to do with how we're encountering these products and their marketing strategies. So for example, do you need to remember the name of the product when you go up to a counter? Or are you trying to they want you to recognize the product in a aisle of hundreds of products? And so Dawn Lerman has done research on this, and the difference between recall and recognition, and found that real words were better for recall because the real word has these deeper semantic meanings and you're more likely to process it and really remember it when you need to just ask for it, say at a pharmacy counter, as opposed to recognition where a distinctiveness of a made-up word is more likely to come across. So then the question is, do we have any say? Are we just sort of like, are these all subliminal messages that are coming around at us? And to compare it to, I guess, voting in juries, I mean, this isn't something that we have a say in. There's people who name products, and they put it on the shelf, and we are exposed to it. And whether it's a negative thing or not, or whether it's a good thing because we like consistency, so if a name is going to convey the same attributes of the actual product, that's a good thing. But there is work on whether we have actually any sort of say in it. Yorkson and Menon did a study where they gave people fake brand names. They used the words Frisch and Frosch for ice cream. And their idea was that Frosch would be more preferred because it was associated with a rich, dark, smooth, all those things of ice cream. And if they told people that the brand name, Frisch or Frosch, and diagnostic information about it, so they either told them this was going to be the name of the product or this is just a test name. People the sound symbolism didn't necessarily affect people. They weren't necessarily more likely to like Frosch for the ice cream. However, if they gave them the brand name and then told them it was just a test name, it was sort of too late, and they were still affected by the sound symbolism. And similarly, if they gave them a cognitive task and they had been impaired, cognitively impaired, the sound symbolism effects sort of still came through. They were more likely to like frosh than frisch, which implies that maybe it's an automatic process, and we are just sort of getting these messages. But like any other automatic process, when we give it the proper attention, we can actually discredit it and control it a little bit. So, for example, if an ice cream name is called Frisch, but you know that it's actually named after Mr. Frisch, maybe there's a picture of a guy on the box, you're less likely to be sort of influenced by the sounds of the actual word. So now, if it's an automatic process, but if we actually pay attention and can control it a little bit if we want to, it's interesting. I encourage us to actually look around our worlds, both in consumer products and elsewhere, and see whether that, now that you're sort of aware of this, to see whether products that are prettier and more feminine are more likely to have higher or front vowels in them, like E. And even beyond the product world, just look in books and movies and see if character names, if their name is sort of befitting to their attributes. Because I would argue that in terms of having a say, no, like we don't really have a say in what product names are, but we have a say in knowing, now we have a say that you know about it, in how, I guess, that seeing it and knowing that, being aware of it.
So I'm going to give an overview of my thesis, and then just spend the last 3 or 4 minutes pretty much just answering the question of the panel. Okay, so my thesis was in sociology, and it asked whether television changes attitudes, and if so, how. And the study had Brown University students watching either Breaking Bad or Weeds. Now, this is a question that really interested me, given the proliferation of television in society. They say a recent study said that 151 hours of television are watched on average per month among Americans, which is an incredible amount of television. It's also an incredible pop culture phenomenon. Millions of viewers tune in on a weekly basis into their favorite series. Millions of viewers tune in to try new shows to become completely invested in. So television certainly plays a very significant role in our lives. And answering the question whether it changes attitudes does sort of suggest the potential for policy reform, not on a very, very grand level, but for television specifically, if we can conclusively find that television does significantly change attitudes, if there are programs that are very violent, that could potentially change attitudes in a very negative direction among its viewers, we could see change in ratings and advisories that would air prior to the programs. So just to give you a little bit of background on the subject, the subject in which I studied, or the field of research is called communication studies, and specifically it's audience research. And so I first looked at cultivation theory, which was proposed in the 1960s by George Gerbner. And basically, he viewed viewers as extremely passive. And he said that media directly influences viewers. You see something on screen, it directly influences your attitudes and your behaviors. You see the mean world hypothesis. This basically came from his research with television violence. And he basically suggested that viewers cultivate this conception of the world as very mean and violent after watching violent television. Now, he distinguished viewers between light and heavy. So the more you watch television, the heavier viewer you are, the more your attitudes will change. Now, the other theory that I used in my research, to guide my research, was British Cultural Studies by David Morley. His is a bit more contemporary, and it represents an intersection of media and sociology, because it doesn't only look at the television program, but it also places a very strong emphasis on the viewer background. What is the viewer bringing into the television viewing experience, and how does that influence whether attitudes change? And so that would be viewer involvement, this sort of interplay. And so he looks at, as I just sort of hinted at, the message depicted on screen, and also how the viewer encodes or decodes the message. Now, I focus on 3 areas in my research. First, I look at perceived realism. I ask whether perceived realism, that is, how realistic a viewer finds the show to be, influences how their attitudes are changed. And so I hypothesized that the more realistic the viewers found their shows to be, the more their attitudes would change. Next, I looked at background and or previous exposure. Now, exposure is exposure to the content that is depicted on screen. And I hypothesized that the less previous exposure viewers had, the more their attitudes would change by virtue of contrast. It would basically form the schema in their mind of what the subject is and their attitudes about it. And lastly, I looked at viewer engagement. How engaged are viewers with the show that they're watching? Are they liking it? Are they talking about it? Are they writing online about it? Are they tuning in every week, or are they missing episodes? And I hypothesized that the more engaged viewers are with the program, the more their attitudes would change. So I looked at the following attitudes. Previous research in the field has mostly looked at attitudes. Let's say they'll do a study on violence in this specific neighborhood depicted on screen, or there were a ton of studies I came across on conceptions or attitudes towards premarital sex, and some on violence and crime, things like that. And I didn't want to do just drug use or drug dealing or just parenting, because I thought if I just focused on one attitude, I could potentially become blindsided to other attitudes that change, and thus would limit the results of my data. So I did look at these 7 different attitudes. 6 for, I'm going to talk about the shows that I used, but only the first 6 are applicable to weeds, because the 7th is methamphetamine manufacturing, which is not applicable to weeds. And that's a good segue to talk about the 2 shows. So first, weeds. I had 8 viewers watching weeds. These were viewers who had no previous exposure. Just to give you some context, Weeds is a program on Showtime. It's a half-hour comedy, and it follows a suburban widow whose husband dies. It's in the pilot. Has already passed away, and she is established as someone who has turned to dealing marijuana to make ends meet in her neighborhood, and it's a comedy. The second show is Breaking Bad, and this is a 1-hour drama on AMC. The premise of this: we have a high school teacher, Walt, who, upon getting diagnosed with advanced lung cancer, turns to cooking and dealing methamphetamine to make ends meet, because he has a lot of medical bills, but also to leave money behind for his family, because he has one child in high school and his wife is pregnant. So these are the 2 shows. So of course, methamphetamine manufacturing is not applicable to Weeds, because Weeds is a show about marijuana. So there, just that. Okay, so how I went about my research. I had screenings, as I said, 8 for Weeds, and I had 18 students for Breaking Bad, 26 total. And the study was over 8 weeks. They watched episodes every week. And the data comes from, first, a pre-survey that established their previous knowledge of the drug of their respective series, their attitudes toward the drugs. And then I had 3 rounds of discussion throughout the study with them to gauge their reactions to the plot development and to see, upon further analysis of the transcripts, if attitudes changed gradually upon viewing more episodes. Then I had a post-survey, which, just to contrast with the pre-survey, to see if attitudes changed. And I asked a lot of, if we go back one slide, one more slide, sorry. I asked directly these questions, whether their attitudes changed, yes or no, and for a bit of explanation on each one of these fronts. So if we now go forward, and then I had a follow-up 10 weeks after the final screening that asked if they continue to watch the series on their own, which would be a measure of viewer engagement. So now, first piece of data is that attitudes did change. We see here attitudes changed for all 7 categories that I tested for, some more than others. You can see from this data, but I have some charts that I decided not to include, but basically you can tell that attitudes changed more for Breaking Bad than for Weeds. In almost every category, they changed significantly more. Now, in the 2 that they didn't, that's MM stands for meth or marijuana. Meth or marijuana dealing and parenting were the 2 attitudes where Weeds viewers changed more, and I attribute that mostly to the fact that Weeds just deals more with parenting and dealing than Breaking Bad. does. But I get more into it a bit later. But this is just basically to show you that attitudes did change. So it does answer the question, does television change attitudes? And the second part is, if so, how? Now, the next part of my presentation deals with that. So first, perceived realism. A number of statistical tests, cross-tabulations, regression analyses suggested or yielded results that say that there is a positive relationship between perceived realism and attitude change. Now, this makes sense. We think about shows that we could potentially just accept at face value. If we think it's very realistic, it would make sense that it would change our attitudes more. Now, I believe I have quotations. Yes, I do. So with Weeds, we have some viewers saying it was totally unbelievable, over-dramatization, and one viewer said their portrayal of a dealer is certainly not realistic. This is just, these quotations are, first of all, quite representative of the other viewers in the study, but secondly, just aim to sort of expose why, or rather to answer why attitudes changed less for Weeds than for Breaking Bad. Now you see with Breaking Bad, we have one quote, "I think it's interesting how they portray the effects of meth as very real. I feel like a lot of when drugs are portrayed in the media, there's some sort of hype, like the scenery sort of changes, and it's like this drug being portrayed, and this is just very integrating the progression of actual events." And one other viewer said, "I'm willing to buy the depiction." In general, Breaking Bad viewers, after an analysis of the many transcripts, it's very clear that they found the show to be very realistic, and that contributed to their attitude change. Next, background and previous exposure. This was my favorite variable because this was less quantitative and more analysis of what the viewers brought to the table when they started the screenings. So first, there's a very stark contrast between the previous knowledge of and experience with marijuana and methamphetamine. There were 8 viewers who were watching Weeds, and all 8 had seen marijuana and smoked marijuana. There were 18 viewers watching Breaking Bad, and not a single one had ever even seen meth in person. So there is a very stark contrast when you walk into the room and start the screening. What you're bringing in, your previous experiences, really will shape how the show will influence you. And we have here, in the post-survey, they responded how likely they are to think of their show in a discussion of meth or marijuana. And it's clear, for Breaking Bad, 83% of viewers said they would be very likely, which was the highest possible response, to think of meth, which just shows that their lack of previous exposure created and shaped many of the attitudes they had of meth in their minds. Now, to quickly address the quantitative analyses, they were mostly inconclusive, actually, because it's hard to quantify previous experiences. It's just inherently something that's qualitative. So if I look at the qualitative responses, we have some more quotations. First with Weeds, we have a quote, "Cigarette smoking, it's disgusting my family, but pot smoking is funny." Another viewer said, "At Brown, there are a lot of students who are weed dealers." And the last viewer, and I particularly like this quote, "I think now most of my friends talk about smoking. I think when you're surrounded by these sorts of attitudes, or it's constantly in the news, and we're constantly talking about decriminalizing or medical marijuana, I think that has more of a desensitizing effect." So basically the shock value isn't there. They're watching Weeds, they're familiar with weed. There's nothing really new there, for the most part. For Breaking Bad, we have very different quotes. "I had very few, if any, ideas about what meth looked like or what its effect was before watching the show. It's my only exposure to meth, so I'm automatically drawn there, every aspect of it." And we had one viewer actually even compared to Weeds, because he had watched Weeds on his own, and he said, quote, "Even talking about Weeds, I've been exposed to pot before, and it just wasn't as strong of a show." So there you go. And I have just many, many more quotations that reinforce this idea of how previous exposure and background really do correlate with attitude change in an inverse relationship. Finally, I look at viewer engagement. I like these graphs. First, we have, I'll show both at once. So basically, I asked viewers to rate their shows, how much they enjoyed it, how addictive, boring, dramatic, funny, realistic, satisfying it is. So basically, you see that on every single front, Breaking Bad did significantly better than Weeds. Breaking Bad was enjoyed more than Weeds. The only variable or question where Weeds did better was how boring the show was. So clearly Breaking Bad viewers like their show more. And I like to also highlight that Breaking Bad even did better in funny, even though Weeds is a comedy and Breaking Bad is a drama. So it's pretty irrefutable that students, at least in this sample, very much enjoy Breaking Bad more than Weeds. Now, does this mean more attitude change? Well, we see, we're not there yet. First, we have descriptive information of how engaged they are. So 78% of Breaking Bad viewers sympathized with their protagonist, that was Walt, whereas none of the viewers sympathized with Nancy, their protagonist, who was also in a very dire circumstance of making ends meet, but they weren't as engaged in sort of on an emotional level. Then 61% of viewers continued to watch after the conclusion of the study, whereas only 25% for Weeds continued to watch. And every Breaking Bad viewer would recommend the show to a friend, whereas only half would for Weeds. So you see there's this disparity. And these quantitative analyses that I ran, again, regression analyses, cross-tabulations, suggest a statistically significant relationship, positive relationship, between viewer engagement and, finally, and attitude change. Now, I think I have a quote, for one for each show. So Weeds viewers, we have one saying, "I thought the acting was horrible and the show's premise was just so unrealistic. I also hated Nancy's character." Okay. And Breaking Bad, "The stakes have been unbelievably high, which makes for compelling drama." Again, I know I'm being selective. There were some Weeds viewers who did really like Weeds, and there weren't any Breaking Bad viewers who really disliked Breaking Bad, but there were some who were less excited about it. But in general, whatever I'm including in the slides is pretty representative of the majority of the viewers. There are many quotes I could have included. So discussion of the results. First, as I just explained, all three variables that I tested did indicate correlation with attitude change. Now, going back to cultivation theory and British cultural studies, cultivation theory looked at how passive the viewer is. British cultural studies looked at how active the viewer is, using their previous experiences to negotiate the depictions on screen. And basically, both are valid, both are applicable in different circumstances, and basically, much like the previous research in the field, basically the conclusions in audience research and in attitude change for television basically concludes very limited effects, or you can only conclude correlation but not causality, because at the end of the day, when viewers stop watching their television, they go into the real world and they're exposed to countless variables that could influence their attitudes on marijuana, on meth, and I as a researcher and no other researcher in the field could control for that. So that's why there is limited effects here. There's a very famous quote: "The bulk of media effects research suggests a model of limited effects. Some media have some effects on some viewers in some circumstances." Further research can look more specifically at comedies versus dramas, which I looked at a little bit, but not very in depth. Perhaps with the second bullet, maybe reading newspapers is just as would make you just as prone to attitude change as watching television. Maybe not. That's an area for research. And finally, I didn't test whether these attitudes that changed, whether they're short-term or long-term, because this wasn't a longitudinal study. So now if I have two, I don't. I'm out of time. Oh no. Okay, well,
we'll get back to
me later.
Question and answer.
That's fine.
So this whole issue of viewership and identification really resonates with what I'm about to talk about too. So I'm glad you introduced that. My project is entitled Gender, Race, and Reality Television, Discourses of Sisterhood on Braxton Family Values, and this is part of my Gender and Sexuality Studies capstone project. So I want to introduce, by means of giving a brief autobiographical background to explain how I arrived at this particular topic. And I also want to foreground that really my goal within this whole project and this whole thought process that I've engaged in is to think about how reality TV might have possibilities and limitations for particular feminist goals. So really, this relationship between reality TV and feminism is at stake within my project. So to start off, I have a confession to make to you all tonight, which is that I'm addicted to reality TV. This photograph is of me and Tiffany New York Pollard of Flavor of Love and I Love New York fame. I got a chance to meet her last month at Northeastern University. It was really a life-changing experience. So I really am drawn towards reality television. I find it to be extremely entertaining. And then the problem with this is that, for me at least, is that there are all these feminist critiques of reality TV. So for this project, I looked at a few different texts. One of them was this book, Enlightened Sexism, written in 2010 by Susan Douglas. And she's arguing in this book that on reality TV, sisterhood, not only is sisterhood not powerful, but it's also utterly impossible. So she spends a lot of time in this book fleshing out exactly what all the problems are with representation on reality TV, how women are portrayed in particular ways, but also specifically how there's really no possibilities for women to form a community amongst each other and to support each other. And for her, this concept of sisterhood is really integral to what feminism means in this particular context. Another article that I looked at was written by a Newsweek journalist, Allison Samuels, and she was talking specifically about relationships between black women and how there's this formula that's rising on current day reality TV where black women are cast and kind of pitted against each other on particular shows. And so she calls this an unsettling new formula, and that really why the question of reality TV is so at stake within this as well is that the presumption is that women are just being themselves, and so there's not presumed to be a script, at least on paper. There's not a script, although that's up for question too. That's something we can talk about. And so it's really this concept that it's reality, and certainly when we watch reality TV, we do see many instances of name calling, as we've seen on Bad Girls Club on Oxygen, of drink throwing from Basketball Wives on VH1, and of even wig pulling on Real Housewives of Atlanta on Bravo. So recognizing these problems that there are with representation, I want to make this intervention and think about how can we not just categorically dismiss reality TV as trash, as some of these other feminist scholars have done, but really engage with it. And I think this is important because reality TV is increasingly popular, as we all know, and I think that popularity makes this question not only relevant, but also really ethically imperative. So we can't just kind of lay it on the side and say it doesn't matter, but we need to really think about what's going on. So my research questions that I developed based on this, this initial engagement were, how do discourses of sisterhood operate on reality TV? And following that, how do viewers engage with these representations of sisterhood? So unlike some of the secondary literature that I looked at, I really want to focus on one particular show, because one problem that I found in the methodology of the secondary literature I looked at was that there were these broad generalizations being made about reality TV. And when you think about it, there's all types of shows on reality TV. There's documentary type shows, there's competitions, there's all different types of subgenres within reality TV. So I wanted to think more specifically and do a type of case study. So I decided to choose this particular show, Braxton Family Values, and to first of all watch the first season of the show and do an analysis of it, and then also to read the online blog commentary to see how this concept of sisterhood is operating in that realm as well. And the question of why did I choose this particular show, it's a very interesting case study because sisterhood is operating on multiple levels, because the main cast of characters are actually sisters in this kind of biological / biological fantasy type of way. And also that all of the main characters are black women, and so there's kind of this site in which we can understand that representation on its own terms and not always kind of in constellation to other things. So I want to start off, how many of you have watched Braxton Family Values, have some level of familiarity? Okay, well, given that rather small sample size, I hope that you all indulge me in just watching a 2-minute clip so that you can all get a sense of this particular show.
I'm Toni Braxton. You might know that I'm a 6-time Grammy Award-winning performer who sold over 40 million records worldwide, starred in 2 Broadway plays, and headlined my own show in Las Vegas. What you don't know is that I have 4 younger, amazing sisters, all talented in their own right, but none of them to this point have shared my level of success. I'm Tracy. I left the music business entirely. Now I'm in Maryland living with my husband, my son, and my mother-in-law. Let's just say I'm not that happy about that.
Maybe I need to see a psychiatrist. Maybe.
You, Tamar.
I'm Tawanda, the middle sister. I have a husband, 2 beautiful kids, and I'm Tony Braxton's assistant.
You're about lying.
I'll figure it out.
Listen to me.
I'm Trina. I'm a backup singer for Tony, and I sing in my own band. I also have marital problems, but I deal with them in my own way.
I'm looking for your bands.
Let's just have a glass of wine.
I'm Tamar. I also sing background for Tony, but I'm also trying to launch my own solo career with the help of my husband Vince, who, by the way, also manages Tony. I may be the baby of the family, but that does not mean I don't get to boss people around.
So, let's just tone that down.
I can sing. Don't you remember that? Wait, Mary, I didn't know that. Now I know.
There's plenty of drama in my family, and we can definitely get on each other's last nerves. But at the end of the day, we all love each other and know that there's nothing more important than family.
Sisters. Great. So just to recap a little bit of what we saw right there, as we can see, this is a type of documentary style show, and it stars Grammy Award-winning R&B superstar Toni Braxton and her 4 alliteratively named younger sisters, Tracy, Tawanda, Trina, and Tamar. And their mother, who also wasn't shown in that little intro clip, Evelyn, she's also a very central character on that show. So really, what my whole argument is within this is that sisterhood is not somehow defined against drama in this show, but rather through it. So as Tony says at the very end of that clip that we watched, there's plenty of drama in my family, and we definitely get on each other's nerves, but at the end of the day, we all love each other, and we know there's nothing more important than family. So in a way, this is both interesting and also troubling, because we see that there is this concept that they have a love for each other, but that's also kind of constituted through this very normative concept of what family is, and that it's always kind of that concept that's being deployed to kind of quell any conflict that's happening. So what I want to think about is how can we pull apart this concept of sisterhood so that on one hand we understand it's kind of this biological idea that we have about this relationship between these women, but then also how sisterhood is not a given, but it's built, right? So how can we think about these women as sisters, not just that they share genetic information, but also that they kind of have this very particular social formation and community amongst them. So what's interesting and what we got a taste of in that little clip is that there's all these rivalries kind of brewing over different levels of career success. There's tension surrounding relationships, and all of that is kind of mutually constitutive of how sisterhood is being constructed. So this quote that I have here, "Drama, Tears, and Sisterly Love," is actually from the Season 1 reunion, which was hosted by talk show host Wendy Williams. And she promises more drama, tears, and sisterly love for future seasons of the show. And so I think this is really important because it shows kind of this unity amongst all of this. So it's not that all of this conflict that we're seeing is somehow always undermining any concept of community amongst these women, but rather that it's part of how they're negotiating their particular relationship amongst each other. So then thinking more in depth about sisterhood and spectatorship, my methodology for this was really kind of anecdotal, and so taking a look at the blogs that were posted in as this whole first season was airing last year, and thinking about how women, and particularly black women on these blogs, were imagining themselves in relationship to this particular community of sisterhood. So I wanted to start off thinking about what Bell Hooks argues in her essay, The Oppositional Gaze, Black Female Spectators, saying that there's power in looking. And so what Bell Hooks is talking about in that essay is actually disidentification of between black women and kind of televisual representations of blackness historically in the United States. But what I want to do to extend this argument is to think there's also power in blogging and commenting and posting, albeit a different type of power, but still that's a site through which control over representation is flowing. So even though it's always difficult when you're dealing with stuff on the internet because there is kind of this disembodied anonymity, what's interesting is that when you look at these comments, a lot of women, or a lot of commenters in their responses are actually self-identifying in terms of race and gender and actually saying, I am a black woman and I identify with this particular episode, this particular conflict, this particular thematic element of the show. So I really like this quote from a user, Lisa Dees, in response to the episode 9 blog, which is that everybody has a little Braxton in them. So what's interesting is that we're seeing this total viewer identification with these particular characters, and we even see that in terms of when we look at the website, there's kind of this tone set. Which sister are you most like? So you take the quiz, you take the survey, and you get your results. You are most like Tony, you are most like Tawanda. And so what I think is interesting is that this actually presents a very different type of problem, which is not that women are totally, that these women that are commenting are totally disidentified with the characters, but they're actually so identified with them that they're aspiring to these particular fantasies about sisterhood. And so there's also this one quote from a blogger named Aneen, who writes, "My mom comes over to watch the show with me. She cried one episode and said she only wished her daughters were close like that. These sisters and their mom have the most wonderful, genuine, close relationship." So here what's interesting is that there are these kind of unfulfilled desires to replicate these very particular relationships, and that seems actually in a way to be somewhat of a different problem from what we see in the secondary literature where these feminists are critiquing reality TV for presenting these totally negative representations of relationships amongst black women. It's actually that there's something going on where these viewers are internalizing this particular type of sisterhood and really wishing that they had that. And so it's kind of a different type of issue that it presents. And so thinking about this and in terms of do we have a say in representation, the first question that I want to pose is who is we? So I think especially in terms of this project, thinking about my subject position as somebody who's doing a kind of scholarly analysis of this, somebody who's not black identified, someone who's not female identified, how am I also kind of like re-representing this particular dialogue that's going on between the show itself and also the viewers and their responses to it? So, but then thinking about all the things that I've looked over and kind of how there's multiple levels happening here, I think that the power over representation is operating at multiple levels within reality TV. So thinking specifically about this particular show I looked at, but I think it can also be applied to other shows in terms of the performance of the characters of the cast, in terms of how they kind of discuss things amongst themselves, how they set up particular events, or how they live their lives basically when the cameras are watching them. Then in terms of the production, so how the editors and how the other producers, what's interesting is that Tony actually is one of the executive producers of this show, so there's also control over that particular element of this. And then the third level, and not to say that this is the lowest level, I think it's actually extremely important, is the interpretation level amongst the audience. So then how there are these conversations happening on these particular sites where people are really engaging further with what sisterhood means, and it's not just kind of being, it's not that it's just being ingested for what it is necessarily on the show, but there's this very fraught and complex dialogue about what this particularly means in this context. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Professor Cohee to kind of facilitate the open discussion.
So we don't have very much time, which is too bad, but because these were so interesting, it was hard to really want to stop anybody. I'm going to let you all talk about how you see this, but one of the things I was certainly thinking about by starting with talking about voting and juries and then all of this, do we have any say, is of course the next election brought to you by TV that we're going to have. And so one of the things I think about a lot certainly are, of course, the intersections of race and community building and gender, and then representations in terms of how are we presented in some high stakes things like the next presidential election. So I was wondering too if we could tie some of those things in, because we've had so much talk about money and super PACs and that kind of thing. How can we become smarter consumers, and how can we look at community in some useful ways as presented by representation, particularly TV. I'm fascinated by the sounds thing too. I'm just going to keep thinking about that too. And how this stuff does make us in some ways smarter consumers of our own culture, if we're aware of it.
I have a question if nobody else does. I'm curious for you, because in cognitive science experiments, people try to not do self-report questions. So if you're testing attitude, as opposed to asking, did your attitude change, you would try to figure that out in some other way. And I'm curious, when you were asking people questions about how their attitude changed in terms of being self-aware, whether people are like, oh yeah, I guess it did change, or I hadn't thought about that, whether you got, what the responses were to like people thinking about whether their attitudes had actually changed or not.
So viewers on the outset didn't know what I was studying, and I worded the questions at the end such that I was still, first of all, it was like embedded in like 1,000 other questions, so they didn't really know what I was looking for. But yeah, that is something to take into account, like the fact that there is self-report bias and maybe it's not entirely representative.
Did you get any like cool feedback, like, oh, I hadn't realized that my idea of parenting changed?
For example, parenting was what I was going to say. Parenting was one that wasn't very much addressed in Breaking Bad, and some viewers flat out said, no, I never even thought about parenting once. But others did say, yeah, Walt is this kind of a father, blah blah blah, and like actually I did think more about being a father and X, Y, and I thought that was really interesting. And so actually that does bring up the question though whether the attitude change is actually like conscious, because in that sense, many of them were like, oh, I didn't realize that I even changed my attitude. So yeah, and actually just to address your question about the elections and how the news may represent it, I did do some readings on how the news, especially with violence, does portray and influence our perception of the real world. There's been many studies done that support that if the news cycle keeps reporting that there are robberies in the neighborhood, even though there are many other news stories to tell, people are going to be more scared to walk outside. But if that same news program just focused on some other things, it would cultivate different attitudes and perceptions. So that was on violence, and I imagine the same would apply on elections, a similar sort of background framework.
Any questions from out here? Yes.
I have a question for Sam. I was just curious if you could just elaborate more on how viewers were selected, because I know you said that some of them had experienced marijuana, but none of them had experienced methamphetamine.
Right.
So just like, what was the sifting process for them?
The sifting, to be completely candid, I just took whoever I can get.
Okay.
But there was one major stipulation, which was you were not allowed, or you could not have had previous exposure to these series. Because I wanted to see sort of how the exposure to this series influences attitudes. So that was the only thing. I just advertised as much as possible and got not a huge sample size, but something.
And they were all Brown students?
And they were all Brown students, undergrads.
I have one for Sam, for Tyler. So first for Sam, did you see any differences between, because I know one show is half an hour and one is an hour, and maybe in terms of like how that might affect the way people start viewing it because they are exposed longer to it?
So one way I compensated for the length difference is for every screening, Weeds viewers watch 2 per week. So it would amount to an hour. So it actually ended up amounting to the exact same amount of television exposure by minutes. But I do think the genre analysis, comedy versus drama, is an extremely interesting question. Because maybe Weeds isn't meant to change attitudes. It's pretty exaggerated, and I don't think the viewers, or rather the show creators, thought, I'm going to go change attitudes on marijuana. Like, it's pretty crazy of a show. So that's something that can definitely be researched further.
And Tyler, I noticed that you kept mentioning each person in the show as a character, and so I guess in your discussion about how to, and while they're real life sisters, so I guess if you can speak to, the production aspect of it and how you kind of use the word character. I know it's formal use to just.
Yeah, no, that was definitely something that I had to think about in this project because it is reality TV, right? So this question of reality is always operating. So one place that I looked was Jean Baudrillard, who's he has this text, Simulacra and Simulation. So it's kind of all about thinking through kind of what is reality versus what is kind of like a simulation of reality. So in reading this series, what I wanted to do is not make any presumptions that when I'm watching this, I have any idea about what these women's lives are really like. I'm reading it as a text. So I'm recognizing that there's all these levels of mediation, and therefore the Tamar that we see on TV is not necessarily the Tamar as she lives her daily life. And I think a place where this becomes particularly resonant, not only on this show, but on a lot of reality shows, is season 2. Because after season 1, people have gotten their exposure, people are, figuring out their niche within the show, how to kind of play up their particular role, how they fit. And so then you do see kind of people very self-awarely performing a particular version of themselves, right? So that's kind of why I use the word character, not to dehumanize the people that are on the show, of course, but to recognize that in this particular context, I'm reading it in that way rather than presuming anything about their daily life.
Good. Well, this is for Leor and Reuben. Is there any way you guys could do like an impromptu analysis of successful political officials that you know of and the way their names maybe have a connection to like throw out a name and maybe Leor can comment on it?
I mean, I guess like Barack Obama. I don't know your vowels. Well, is that like a good name or a bad name?
I think the first thing that comes to mind with Obama though is like all the controversy that came over his middle name, and that would be that would be more of a semantic thing than a phonetic thing, in that the the meaning of the name and the connection of associations that people made with the name was a negative thing, or sadly a negative thing, I would say, in the news.
I think the other thing is like whether or not politicians go by their first name or their last name is something like, I think Hillary versus Obama, or like oftentimes I think female politicians will go by their first name
or the media
when they run.
Hillary is because there's more than one Clinton. Right. You think Clinton, you think Bill, Hillary is.
But Condi rather than Condoleezza Rice, and like it's just interesting, like the way that people choose the names to sort of.
Will she go by Christina or Paxson?
Right. Yeah.
That's
exactly.
true. How about Newt Gingrich?
He's a double name, right?
Yeah.
Any more questions? Our time's up. I'm really very, very sad to say. These were so interesting, and I wish all of you could have spoken for much longer. Very good.